Now, organizations sometimes also develop production standards or use wage incentives as other ways of determining the worth of the job and delivering financial benefits to their employees. So in terms of production standards, this is basically what does each employee, should we expect them to produce? What type of consistent output can we expect from a worker? Now, how do we do that? We can do this through time studies where we carefully examine the effort and the movements of a worker in order to determine what could a person reasonably be expected to produce consistent. And we can use the data from a time and motion study to develop some standard that we can share with our workers to say, hey, we expect you to produce at this rate. Now we can use that information to reward good performance, and that's what we oftentimes, especially in modern organizations, we're seeing pay being linked to performance, and that might be the performance of an individual in their job, or it might be the performance of a group in the organization or the organization as a whole. And so we can set goals for individuals or for groups and use them in incentive plans. And if those goals are met, then workers receive some added financial reward for achieving the goals. And by doing this, we can increase employee productivity. When people have clear goals, they're more likely to persist and put in more effort and examine their work and make good adaptations to reach their goals. It's using incentive plans is also a great way to attract prospective employees. And so we find that workers who are highly skilled and confident in their skills like to work in organizations that have these kinds of incentive plans because they feel confident that they're going to get that added financial benefit out of their job. And it's a way to reward employees monetarily, to say to those employees, you performed in the way we hoped you would, you're benefiting the organization, and we're going to share some of that benefit with you and reward you, and that way we retain good employees, motivate them to continue to work hard. So since economic issues are mandatory topics of bargaining, both management and union has to come prepared with good arguments to bring to negotiations about wages. And there's a number of different things to consider when developing these arguments from either the management or the union perspective. Some of them have to do with general factors that determine wages, like different features of a job and wage comparability, the organization's ability to pay, productivity, cost of living, legal requirements. There's also competitive factors such as operating efficiency, cost cutting, productivity improvements, and internal factors such as firm-specific labor costs and expected profits and labor market conditions. So let's look more specifically at each of these. So when we talk about differential features of work, again, we said different jobs often receive different levels of pay, and that can result in a wage spread within an organization. Some employees receiving higher pay than other employees. That's very common. So wage spread basically represents that internal distribution of negotiated wage increase in a bargaining unit of employees. For management, it's important to maintain some degree of wage spread. We want to reward skilled employees so they want to keep working for us, okay? And when employees consider their wages, they're not just considering how much am I getting paid, there's also a status to it. They look around and they say, how much am I getting paid compared to other people, and how much am I contributing compared to other people. It's good for management to have the spread also to incentivize lower skilled employees to develop those higher skills, to say, hey, if I develop higher skills, then I will get paid more. Okay, but if the lower skilled workers are getting paid the same as the higher skilled workers, there's not a lot of incentive for those lower skilled workers to improve. For the union focus, it's generally on equality. Okay, they want a single pay rate. So let's look at some more arguments. Wage comparability. We look at the wages across different bargaining units in organizations. Often there's not just one bargaining unit, one union, there's often multiple. Okay, so at the university, there's a bargaining unit for the faculty, and there's a bargaining unit for the police, and there's a bargaining unit for the clerical workers, and so on and so forth. Okay, and as we learned in chapter 6, when there are multiple units, bargaining units in an organization that you have to negotiate, you have to think about the pattern of those negotiations, because what you settle with one bargaining unit is going to have implications for what you give to a different bargaining unit. You can know that the union is going to come in, figure out what you gave a different bargaining unit, and say that, hey, we have to at least get that much. We can also, again, consider the degree of labor intensiveness. We talked about this earlier. If labor is a low percentage of the total cost of operating in an organization, there's more room to negotiate for wage increases in many cases. Okay, but if you've got an organization that's high in labor intensiveness, where the workers make up, let's say, 80% of the operating costs, there's often not a lot of room for big changes in those labor costs. Now, the ability to pay is often an issue that's talked about a lot, but I think that it's often very difficult to find strong evidence on ability to pay. Organizations are smart to keep their finances close to their chest, especially around negotiations. Okay, and unions are smart to try and get any of that information so they can use those arguments. But different organizations have different levels of transparency. If you've got a private organization, a sole proprietorship, okay, that is not has and doesn't have stockholders, just has private ownership, then management can keep finances very private. Okay. Now, if you're a publicly traded organization, then there are some requirements on reporting to the SEC and to stockholders, and unions can get that information and get a little better idea of the ability to pay. In public organizations, often there are legal requirements for a high level of transparency. Okay, but even in public organizations, managers and executives find ways to obscure financial information. Okay, budgets can be very opaque. Now, unions expect that when the conditions are good, that workers will receive higher wages. But unions are very hesitant to give any kinds of wage concessions, even when financial conditions decline. Okay? In extreme cases, like the financial downturn of 2008, we saw unions making those kinds of concessions. But that's because those organizations were on the verge of bankruptcy. And when the organization goes bankrupt, all bets are off. Okay, all contracts are canceled. And so in those types of situations, when you're facing bankruptcy, unions are more likely to agree to some form of wage concessions. Now, productivity, again, conceptually, productivity should be determined by the workers, okay? It's their output and related to the costs. Okay, and the costs are the wages, and the output is the work of those workers. But there's other reasons for productivity increases, especially in the modern era with changes in technology. So organizations that purchase new equipment and technology can argue that that is the reason we've had productivity increases, not because workers are working harder or working smarter. Okay. Now, as a person who's been in a union, okay, and led a union, I would always argue that, well, wait a second, more technology means you have to work smarter. And if you're demanding higher skills out of your workers, you should be demanding higher wages. So there's arguments on both sides of that last point. So cost of living is another big one here. Cost of living has to do with inflation. Unions demand higher wages because they want the purchasing power of their workers' wages to remain constant. If there is consistent inflation that is not matched by comparable changes in wages, then people are working the same amount for less. And that less is because they're, even though it's the same amount of dollars, those dollars don't have the same purchasing power. Now, there's different ways of figuring out inflation, but the consumer price index is what most people use, and that is determined by the federal government. It's an index that measures the monthly changes in the prices of goods and services in a typical household. You can also look at things like comparable worth. This is very interesting, I think, in terms of when we're talking about different jobs that are comparable in terms of their conditions and their skills, but they're not the same jobs, they're not the same tasks. And I think this becomes particularly interesting in jobs that have a gender focus or a gender leaning to them. In the old days, there used to be men's work and women's work, and thankfully we've gotten beyond much of that. But still, some jobs tend to be occupied more by men, and other jobs tend to be occupied more by women. And those jobs occupied more by women tend to be lower paying jobs. And unions can make arguments that, hey, they require the same skills, they have very similar conditions to these male-dominated jobs that are higher paid, and therefore we should be getting higher paid because our worth is comparable, even though the work isn't equal. Okay, it's not exactly the same job. It's a job that requires comparable skills. It's a job that is comparable working conditions, and therefore it should require comparable pay.